But you also have to manage between having enough clansmen, who are the people who kind of provide all the food and resources and ability to move through the world, as well as your fighters. And I was wondering if there was a real differential between those, whether there were people who were just fighters and people who were just farmers or just hunters, or whether kind of that was a shared responsibility and everyone pitched in along the way.
Well, we certainly, again, going back to the sagas, it seems like there were people who did both. There were stories about people who looked after the farm, had an enormous sort of following. They were big landholders, and then they went off and led raids, and then they came back and they looked after the farm again. Now, whether how specialised the soldiers were within a party, I'm sure that changes over time as well.
Yeah, I mean there were some that seem to take up paid mercenary work, such as the ones that end up as part of the emperor's bodyguard in Constantinople, that go down that route. Yeah. But I think the majority, your roles shift according to circumstances. Indeed, sometimes are merchants as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have in England the Great Army eventually settles down and becomes landowners.
Yeah.
If you're a merchant and you're travelling around to places where you want to sell your wares that are a long way away, you'd probably be pretty unwise to go without weapons, so that the roles kind of do overlap.
Another thing which I think is in video games we rarely get to see children in them, and one thing that this game does really interestingly is include the role of children and play. And I was wondering what sort of examples we had of children's toys or children at play within Viking society.
I think it's probably quite hard to find many examples of archaeology, but there's no doubt, children were part of these forces. I mean, so if you think of the length of time that some of the groups had been travelling, then the whole children would have grown up on those campaigns. Yeah.
And I can think of sort of graves of sort of adolescents. There's an adolescent man I can think of from Scotland, which is he's buried with a full grave set of sword and spear and all that sort of thing. So they're there and they're integrated into society, but it's a difficult job getting at them. Lots of people work on it, but it's a difficult job.
So we have here the god of waters and protection of people who are sailing. And so he goes into a big explanation about what she is, but essentially what it kind of comes down to is that they believe that she would move around the place all the time, and so they tried to tie her, the humans tried to tie her to the land with these big ropes, and so every time the ritual is when you go past you have to pull on the ropes to make sure that she will give you a favour as you sail through the seas, even though the gods are now dead.
No idea where
that's creativity, I think. There's quite a lot of canvas in those camps.
Yeah.
That'd be quite an expensive camp to build, I think, that amount of textile.
What would we expect to see more of in terms of how camps would be set up?
Yeah, our best guess is that it's canvas, but you maybe reuse some of your sails as as awnings for some of the larger tents when you make camp.
But yeah, all we have is just the tent holes, the post holes, right?
Well, we don't really even have those.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's rather the lack of major building foundations and evidence for structures on some of these sites that just makes us assume that they are sort of temporary structures that don't really leave any archaeological evidence.
If they're staying for a decent period of time, we're probably talking about more than bivouac kind of things, aren't we?
Yeah.
They talk a lot of the time about the serpent and about its kind of role in the world as being this fearsome beast which used to answer to the gods, but now that the gods are dead, it's basically forgotten its duties and is out doing whatever it pleases, trying to restore its own sense of order. But the iconography and sort of talk about serpents and snakes is like really reoccurring throughout the entire of the Banner Saga. I was wondering sort of what evidence we have about serpents and what role they might have had within the mythology or in the worldview of the people.
Well, certainly very, very common in the mythology. They're there in the stories about the world serpent, and which Thor goes fishing for. And we have serpent-like creatures in all sorts of art. We get swords being referred to as serpents. And it's mixed up with our idea of the dragon. It's the same thing, basically.
Yes. And often they're associated with guarding treasure hoards as well, that you don't want to disturb the dragon or the serpent. Yes, it's guarding the treasure. It's the idea that Wagner takes up as well in the Rings.
So it's coming on to 12:30. I don't know if there's anything else you would show. I mean, happy to play the game as long as you guys are willing to talk.
I'm starting to feel cold with all this snow and ice.
No, I think that there's a bunch more of the sort of pre-prepared questions, so we can move away from the gameplay and go more into just answering some of the more hidden miss questions. So I think we've covered off a bunch of them already. But one thing we haven't seen yet is the guy who had the big bear cloak. He's a berserker, and basically the way which they try to represent berserking within the world is that when he makes one kill, he can then move forward and make another for free. Like, he can just keep chaining and chaining and chaining. I was wondering, sort of, berserking is obviously something that in our cultural memory of Vikings is very, very strong. But what either written or kind of other evidence we might have as to what this was, how it happened, and sort of what role it took within warfare itself.
I don't really know where the idea of berserkers comes from.
No, I don't think we have anything to really suggest that it means anything in any real sense in the Viking Age. And if it did, what it looked like is anybody's guess, really, I think.
I think the next one from this one is that a lot of the food in the world is as like dried meats, especially fish, which get dried onto fish racks, or fresh hunted meat. And I was wondering, in terms of like the ships which went on like long voyages, what kind of supplies they would have taken with them, and how they would have prepared a lot of that for the journeys.
That's absolutely right. Dried and salted and smoked meat is really important in the Viking Age, and towards the end of the Viking Age, it becomes one of the real sort of staples for their sort of expanding sort of mercantile world. So it starts off as something which is useful if you want your food to last a long time. Over winter or on long voyages. Obviously things like dried fish would be great for a long maritime voyage, but they can also be traded over great distances as well. They barrel it up and they sell it off all the way around Europe. It becomes a really kind of important thing.
Salted cod and salted herring were a staple part of the diet.
Yeah. Another thing is, obviously in this world, all the horses have been completely killed off, so people travel by foot, but there are beasts, yoxes, which act as kind of caravan carriers. And I was wondering sort of what role horses or other beasts of burden would have had in the world, whether we see them archaeologically as being important to caravan travelling, or what role they might have had.
Well, horses were tremendously important and part of your status. There were, because if you were hunting, then having a horse as well as a pack of hounds was really important, and just the mobility that we know that the army had. They must have been moving on horseback quite a lot. I don't think we have much evidence for other animals being used as sort of beasts of burden, sort of carrying the supplies in the way that we're seeing there. I think we see them more just in a farming context, for ploughing and so forth.
But there's no doubt the horses are important. All the way through the early medieval period, we find horses in quite elaborate graves put together with people, with all the fittings, their harness accessories, which are quite often very ornate and very over the top. And that kind of theme continues into the Viking Age as well.
Yeah.
We know that the army have to be getting around with horses, don't they? It's not just that they're not only a sort of maritime.
Yeah.
And you want to take them with you to the next world as well, to Valhalla.
A big question is how much they're being eaten.
Yes.
Because there's obviously a sort of Christian restriction on eating horse meat, which is not the same in other societies. So that's something there's research going on at the moment about that.
In the world as well, before all the horses get killed off, there was often ritual killings of the horses if they were either captured or if they needed to offer them for something. And again, there's an example of a horse out at Mosgard, which has something like 470 separate wounds on it from being ritually killed. So is there a lot of evidence of the ritual killing of horses in the archaeological record?
Yeah, particularly from a ship burial, a likely ship burial in Denmark, where there are large numbers of horses were slaughtered and laid out in the ship. Yeah.
There are some very strange burials in Scandinavia which involve lots of different sorts of animals being butchered in different ways and what seem to be quite choreographed ways over the body of the individual whose grave it is.
Yeah, so I think in this game the only burials that we've seen with the dead, they mostly get left because they're on the go all the time, or they get left in the battlefield. And the only burials that we've actually seen, or the only sort of ritualized or ceremonial send-offs, has been the very traditional kind of send them off in the boat and the flaming arrow off. In terms of leaving people on the battlefield, is that something that would have been done, or would we see much more care to collect people up afterwards and give them a burial? Or do we simply not know a lot of the time?
We probably don't know if bodies were left on the battlefield, as they wouldn't survive. We do have several mass graves, though, where people who'd been killed were gathered up and thrown fairly carelessly, but nonetheless sort of put in a hole.
And early medieval battlefields are sort of notoriously difficult to find. You can imagine the victors take away anything of any value at the end of the battle, that you're not left with an awful lot there. Julian is the person to tell us about military burials, I think, in England at least.
I think another question that would come up here is this idea that a lot of the people in the world might have been captive, or they would have been captive, but when they had children, the children themselves were born free and brought up as part of the society. Do we have a lot of evidence in terms of slavery or people being captives, and what happened when they had children? Were they then free people in that society, or did the sort of slavery continue, or captive continue through generations?
That's a good question. Slaves are always very difficult to see archaeologically, but we do have lots of documentary sources for slaves, no doubt. A lot of what was the Vikings were doing when they was capturing slaves and then trading them. I don't think that the idea of people then being born free is likely, though. I think you would probably stay as in that slave position.
I would think so, but it's a sort of argument that, much more has been written from a sort of a literary perspective about slaves than has from archaeology, really.
Of course,
but we know that they're in large numbers.
And I think the last question that we haven't covered off, because we've covered off a huge array of these questions actually just through playing the game, is that you mentioned before that there was probably not a hugely literate society, and that a little bit gets reflected. We have key people in the society who record things, but in terms of kind of wider communications between people in the group or between other caravans, it's all done through word of mouth. Certainly at Mosgard there are examples of quite snarky comments being recorded onto either bone or bits of wood and being sent between people. And I was wondering if that was something that is widespread, or it's sort of a more concentrated thing. Like, would we expect to see it in a game like this, where people are communicating between different caravans, whether that would have been by word of mouth or by written communications as well?
Well, there are quite a lot of examples of small artefacts with runic inscriptions on that never really say very much of interest.
No.
Look at this piece of bone, I made a comb. Sometimes things like kiss me, and that's something you get. So they are clearly being used in communication. Probably they're being used for slightly more sort of mystical purposes than that as well, maybe. And then we get graffiti. There's a Neolithic tomb in Orkney which seems to have been broken in towards the end of the Viking Age or just after, and has a large quantity of graffiti all over the inside of it, which says
Some of it quite scurrilous.
some of it quite sexually focused.
Yeah.
Some of it, I wrote these runes up high. Things like
Yeah.
that. So there's a level of literacy there for sure, but how widespread it is and what it's being used for is difficult to say, really.
There is actually a point in the game when you're at one of the godstones and one of the characters is very frustrated, and there's an option to actually be able to deface the monument. And as an archaeologist, I had a real problem with that. But actually hearing that was something that which went on kind of gives it a bit more context.
Yeah.
I guess the last things we've covered off pretty much all the rest of the questions as to whether Colleen had any questions that have come up from your perspective.
No, I think that we've covered a lot of them. I definitely appreciate you guys taking the time out to do this. I think it'll be fantastic when we can rebroadcast it.
Yes.
It's been fun, thank you very much. Yeah.
So, well, actually, okay, I do have a question. What would you like to see out of games like this?
Gosh. I think there's quite a potential with games for telling stories of individuals, the sort of biography of individuals, in a bit of the way this does, but in a very realistic way to get across an impression of what living at that time would have been like.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and again, I think this probably actually does do this more than I think I expected games to. That it does mesh together those worlds of the sort of the merchant and the farmer and the warrior quite nicely. It would be nice to see games like this looking at aspects of everyday life, I think, and how that was organised. It may be somebody happily tending their farm, and then it sort of everything gets thrown into chaos when a ship appears on the horizon, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Quite nice to explore, I think.
Yeah, I think especially in the first of the Banner Saga, there's a lot more talk about the life prior to the wars and about how they kind of were managing life and how they made that transition into being in full-out warfare. And that was something that I've never actually seen in a game before. And the way which it's done through these very personal narratives which tackle these wider scale problems, I think they say themselves, it's not necessarily accurate, but it brings up a lot of questions and a lot of authenticity. And one of the things that I'd like to see is for them to provide a bit more context and linkage to the actual archaeological record and to how we could sort of tie between this great world and these great questions they're asking and what we actually ask as archaeologists.
Yeah.
I mean, what this does do is it ties together the sort of environmental reasons where things happen and the social reasons, and the whole sort of climate change thing happening.
Yeah, the causes of the Viking chestnut. Yeah.
So the landscape here isn't just a backdrop.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of driving things along. So that's quite nice to see.
Yeah.
It's a difficult argument for a lot of archaeologists, that relationship between the environment and the social and political cause of things, how those things relate together. And this is having a go at that, which is quite laudable, I think, really.
And I think in terms of if people were playing the Banner Saga and were interested in finding out more about the archaeology of the Viking period, are there resources that we could point them towards which would be useful and attainable for them to get some more information from?
Well, we've been able to plug you out.
You can follow us both on Twitter.
Okay, listen, I think if there's no further comments, we can wrap this up.
Yeah,
Thank you so
very
much.
guys.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.